Welcome to Werewolf the podcast. This is your werewolf Will, and this is episode 26. I've already talked about meeting my werewolf tribe, meeting my wife, and now I'm going to meet another character, meeting grandfather. Often away, I would meet the most interesting characters. Some of them would be on the hunt. This is where I met her grandfather. He was entirely wolfen. Wolfen is when a werewolf goes fully wolf, spending very little time in any form but his wolf form. Grigory was a giant wolf amongst giant wolves, and he'd been the original patriarchal head of the family. Wolves don't have alphas, as we're told they do, but if they did, then this would have been the original one of the werewolves. I was a big wolf, but he stood another head above mine. I did not meet him until the third trip away. Apparently, he met up with the rest of the family, pretty rarely these days, but had chosen to join us on the hunt this year. One early evening, after a particularly miserable day in the mountains, we picked our way back to the campsite. It had been wet and blustery, and the prey had been easily spooked and quickly lost in the murk. There had been a moment or two of excitement when a couple of the pack accidentally bumped into a young mother brown bear with her two cubs. Still, after that killing, nothing of note really happened. When we got back to our tents, it was cold and raining and the light was fading. We were all ravenous, as were the biting flies who tortured us each evening. The little bastards were not deterred by the damp weather and had the unique ability to break the hide of a werewolf. He was just sitting there at the campsite waiting for us, this massive wolf, this strange, enormous beast. His right eye was a patchwork of scars. Half his right ear was missing, and he'd lost a chunk from his nose at some point. I was a little confused, as him being a werewolf, he should have regenerated all that. After such an injury, he should be healthy again. Maybe it was just a wolf, a gigantic fuck-off wolf. What was it doing here, sat so blatantly in the middle of the site? The rest of the pack slowed and sat at the edge of the camp as Al, as his father, went forward, head down towards the sitting wolf. As a wolf, you could tell that this creature was different from even us. It frightened a full-grown male werewolf. What could scare a fully grown werewolf? I'd never known anything like this. Al was extremely cautious as he moved towards the beast. His ears were flat, and he made himself look as small as he possibly could, each step forward hesitant and crouching. He would pause to sniff and lift his head every now and again. He was constantly checking the demeanour and the reaction of the other animal. The giant wolf himself just sat there looking around at his surroundings. Only now and again would he look back at the approaching Al, showing little interest in him, really. Al slowly got closer, and the big wolf's ears pricked up. He started slowly stretching and getting to his feet, a little like the family dog at home. The tension then dissipated, and the two wolves ran to greet each other. The pleasure in their meeting was very apparent. At first I thought they would fight, but they were play wrestling with each other. It seemed like they were friends who'd, again, not seen each other for some time. At this release of tension, the rest of the pack entered the site. It was surprising to see them all with a submissive air as they met the large wolf. All were happy to see him, yet all showed him tremendous deference. Finally, after all the other wolves had made their greetings, Azza introduced me to him. He looked at me somewhat dismissively, and then he left with Al. That evening we sat around the fire logs in groups talking and laughing about the day. My partner and I sat in a small group of friends chatting when the entire band came to a hush. A huge man had just walked out of the central tent. He was naked to the waist and wore a pair of trousers that had obviously seen better days. A woman came forward and proffered him a blanket that he wrapped around his shoulders, and he made his way to the table where Al and his sons were sat. All eyes were on him, all trying to get a glance of the legend in their midst. He smiled, and the spell was broken, everyone breathing freely again. Once he was seated, the rest of the pack's conversations and the vodka started to flow once more. One of Al's sons then came over to where we were sat, chewing on the remains of a leg bone of something large. Gregory has asked you to join us, he said in a good-natured tone, no threat in his voice. We were motioned towards the main table. I felt nervous as I walked the short distance over to the group. I believe it was this thing that humans might call anxiety. When I got to the table, I was offered a seat next to Gregory. His posit sat behind him. It looked like mine, the same size and colour, the same eyes. A perfect match for Fen. Gregory just sat for some time, observing me. My posit sat close to me, staring at the opposite posit. He then started speaking to me in a language that I had no idea what it was. It wasn't Russian, it was something else. Al at this point smirks, noticing my discomfort. Gregory finished speaking and Azza started to translate for me into English, but was stopped when Al reached for her arm and did the translating himself. Gregory says welcome home. He is asking if you know the history of your dusha, he translated. Dusha means soul in Russian, I think. I smiled and said, thanks, it really feels like home. My dusha is very special. I have shared his memories many times and I know he is ancient. I've been shown and told about those that went before me, but that is all. Al translated for Gregory. Gregory laughed and nodded while he downed a shot of vodka, turning himself more towards me. He began to look serious. He talked once more. Al nodded and then turned towards me. Gregory wants to know that the dusha that you share your life with is his brother's. He wishes to know how you two met and if you have news of his brother. He is confused about why the posit left him, for which reason he did so. I did not recognize Dusha at first. He is the posit linked to Gennady. Gennady was his brother, and why Gregory left us to the wild. This fact is serious, Will. Gregory is very important to my family. I could feel the next few moments would be pivotal. I had no idea as to the names of the people involved in my posit's past, Al. If there is a way to find this out, I would be pleased to answer any questions. He has been my guide and light since I was a very small baby. We love each other dearly. I smiled at my posit, who nodded his head. Al then started talking to Gregory, who nodded his own head and replied a lot with da da da. They carried on with the conversation for some time, and then, when they came to a natural end, they turned to me and smiled. Gregory would like to ask you what is your dusha's memory of his brother. I turned to my posit, or dusha, or whatever I was calling him now, and asked in my mind if he knew of Gennady. The posit's body language told me all. His ears drooped. He sat and dropped his head towards the ground and seemed to sigh mentally. I cannot say all before Grigor. It is Grigor that caused my Gen to leave. He caused him to leave for the sake of lost love. Gen was a great being, a strong being, who instead of hurting his brother would leave and let them be. That broke him. He never made it back. And that's why I left Gen. He wanted me no more in the end. He wanted to pass, my posit said woefully. I thought this conversation will not be as straightforward as I thought it was going to be. Al looked at me, and Grigor looked at me. They both had lit thick cigars and refilled their glasses and sat back, waiting for a reply. Azza was watching me with a hint of mirth on her face. She could see I was uncomfortable because this was a rare situation for me, and she was enjoying it. Both men took a long draw of their individual smokes, and Al leaned in towards me. So, Will, what does Dusha say? Well, he says that he left Gennady because he was broken after something that happened, I replied. Da, continue. He says that Gennady left because of love, I asked. Al smiled at me and leant back in towards Grigor. He looked contemplative as he considered what I had said to him. Grigor nodded at Al a few times as he gave his translation. I saw him physically wince another couple of times, and then when Al had stopped, Grigor's head fell forward into his hands, and he placed the cigar onto a plate near him. After some time, he looked up at Al, and Al nodded. I could almost see him thinking. He then sniffed and sat back in his seat, placing his massive palms on his knees, and just paused. After what seemed a lifetime, Grigor turned towards me and spoke to my posit directly. The posit looked very sad and very shifty. Altana was her name, came the posit's thoughts. Altana, she was Grigor's first wife. She was golden white-furred like her name, and beautiful in all her forms, woman and wolf. She was Grigor's first, but Gennady wanted her. Gennady loved his brother, and she was pregnant with Grigor's child, so Gennady left. She said she loved Grigor, and that she wanted to continue her life with him, and so he left her for his brother's sake. Al and Grigor looked at me. I thought that they had heard the posit. Then I realised that this wasn't the case. Azza squeezed my hand and looked at me imploringly. I leant into Al a little closer and whispered, "This is all a little difficult, Al. I don't think I should share, really." Al reached out and put his hand on my shoulder and looked me in the eye. "I am afraid you have no choice, Will. You have no choice. You must share your douche's thoughts." Right, okay. Well, he says that Gennady was in love with Grigor's wife, and when they found out that she was pregnant, she decided she wanted to stay with Grigor, so Gennady left. I have to admit that I said this very quickly to get it out of the way. It was embarrassing. I had nothing to do with this, yet I felt like this would complicate things with Grigor and Al, and of course, the wife. Al looked me in the eye, and then his eyes dropped to the table as he nodded, putting the cigar back in his mouth. He turned back towards Grigor. He started speaking once more, and Grigor listened, and then turned his head and started staring, not at me, but into me. Only at this point did I realise that Al was Grigor's son, possibly the baby that Altana was carrying when Gennady left. At the end of Al's talk, Grigor leant back in his seat and took a long drag on his cigar. He stubbed it out on the empty plate and then sprang up and walked away without a word. He didn't seem very happy. I stood up as he left the scene and did not know if I should try and appease the giant. Should I say something? Al stood up in front of me and gently put a hand on my chest and pushed me back into my seat. As we watched the figure walk away, his posit remained to stare at mine. Then on the whistle from the distant figure, he sprang after Grigor, and on catching up, they condensed into the wolf and ran into the night. The next few days were very strange for me. I was treated in a very different, deferential way now. The story of what had transpired had spread to the rest of the pack, and they now viewed me and my posit with a new respect. Gennady had been the most prominent and nastiest member of the tribe before he disappeared. He had been a creature of legend in the mountains. He had been the horror in the night. He and his brother had been the pack's leaders and the fathers to many of the tribe. Koshi, a young werewolf, had come to me one evening as I sat by my tent and started to tell me of Gennady. I say young, but his posit had been with him since the founding of the pack, so although he looked 18 years of age, I realised that he was centuries old. He told me one of the most intimidating stories of Gennady's life. After seeing how humans treated each other, he had been a tormentor of men, much like myself, and it was probably one of the reasons I was chosen to be his posit's charge. He hated humanity. His hate had developed from his experiences. My hate? Well, I suppose it was from the mental health issues. I tried to convince myself these issues were not the cause for my psychopathic tendencies. Slightly different reasons, with the same outcome. He told me of a tribal war that was happening at the time in the area. One of the larger tribes took over and killed most of the others they came across. They'd wiped out many local smaller groups and had recently attacked one of the villages near the werewolves' home, and they'd hit it with a swift attempt at genocide. Gennady had been visiting that village that day when they were attacked. The village's destruction had been curtailed by the monster that they had met there. A giant half-man, half-wolf had walked into the attack set by the invading warband. It had smashed and ripped apart the warriors. The attackers had been routed and had retreated, leaving their dead and injured behind. The survivors of the village attack now revered Gennady as some beneficent god. He had saved them, and he had appreciated the private worship at first. After the battle, he had followed the routed survivors of the beaten attackers back to their camp. He had found them in the middle of torturing and raping the captives that the warband had taken from the villages they had previously attacked. After their recent defeat, they must have been preparing to withdraw from the area, taking back the things they had of value, such as slaves and, I suppose, treasure. The valuable and the valuables were being kept. The items and people that did not make the cut were being destroyed. In the eyes of the band, these useless things were worthless, and worse than that, a drain on supplies. So the party was in full barbarous swing before they left. The men had been drinking and had been killing and torturing those that were in their charge. Bodies piled around the area, some horrifically damaged and yet still living, most dead. The night air was full of screams of the tortured and laughter of the torturers. These men were like all humans, moralless when it suited them. Gennady had walked into the camp as a man, and the festivities had come to an end. He was a huge guy, a giant for the time, over a couple of meters tall and barrel-chested with long hair and a beard that went down to his lower chest. He carried no weapons, and he had no clothes covering his muscled body. I imagine that this made his appearance at the camp even more strange and more intimidating for those that saw him. As he walked into the centre of the village, he was followed by more and more armed men. All were keeping a respectful distance from him. They were not stupid people, and the fact that he looked so confident yet so ill-prepared gave the experienced among them enough of an insight to make them very wary. When he had arrived at the central fire pit, he had over 100 men surrounding him. Their confidence had grown as their numbers had, and they began to talk to him, although he could not understand what they were saying. The centre of the camp had a large meeting area outside a vast tent. In the centre of the cleared area was a sizable banked fire, and corpses in different states littered the floor around the base of the fire. Gennady could also tell that some had been thrown onto the fire just for the pleasure of watching them burn. Through the bearskin curtain of the entrance, out of the tent, stepped another giant man. He was actually larger than Gennady by a head and shoulders, and broader across the back than anyone he had ever seen. He was covered in sweat, and naked to the waist, wearing some long leather skin trousers down to his hide-wrapped feet. He was older than many that surrounded him, and his hair denoted that he'd seen at least 50 winters in his time. His body was covered in dust and ash from some ritual, and it highlighted the intricate patterns of scarification that covered his skin. As he moved the hide to one side with his left arm, he ducked below the doorway and wiped his mouth with his forearm. He then stood tall and still, chewed on his last meal. His men went silent, and he nodded and pointed at the nearest, who passed him a massive hammer that the man hefted in 2 hands. It seemed heavy even for him. He walked forwards to Gennady as his men started to laugh and cavort in front of him. They knew what was going to happen. The boss was going to butcher this fool. Gennady smiled at the leader. He made good eye contact with him and raised his arms to the sky and took on his werewolf shape. His heart rate increased as he absorbed his posit, and he started growing into the monster that he loved to be. As if it were some set plan, heavy rain began to fall on the scene. The raindrops pounded down on the earth with a savage roar. This was not one of the gentle showers of the summer, but the beginnings of the late autumn's harsh rainstorms. The water soon pooled on the ground and made the dusty clay into a thick red clinging mud. As the water washed over him and those around him, he noticed people react to what they were seeing happen. Then it was already too late. He had grown in stature. His jaw was extended into its lupine shape, his black pelt enveloped him, and he roared a guttural exclamation of his anger and fury. The men in front of him were stupefied, unable to move or respond. The large man holding the hammer was either fearless or stupid. He carefully walked forward, raising his weapon. He lifted it high to bring it smashing down on the werewolf's head. Gennady waited for the downward swing and caught the hammer in the palm of his hand as it hit with full force. He absorbed the shock of the strike with a little movement of his upper arm. Reaching forward with his head, he bit through the haft of the weapon and stamped on the lead leg of the wielder, folding it at the shin. As the hammer-hefting man fell, he was hit with the downward swing of the hammerhead. Gennady held it in his hand and used it to crush the brain box of his attacker. The impact was of such force that the skull burst. Stepping over the already cooling corpse, Gennady twisted his body and threw the head of the weapon into the chest of the nearest warrior, crushing his ribs and sending him flying several yards into the crowd. With each step he struck, raking out the guts of a man rushing at him, and at the same time grasping the throat of the neck, squeezing his fingers together to crush the neck and spine while removing the head with a yank. His ferocity kept him moving forward in his now murderous frenzy. He caught and lifted the next man, throwing him into the crowd, and followed him into the hole that the body created. Within a few steps he killed or maimed a dozen men, and had not yet broken his stride. Like a scythe clearing through the heads of wheat, he laid those around him to the ground, taking the harvest of heads. At this, many of the war band turned their backs to run from the scene, only to be stopped by those that had not had the chance to react yet. A man swung a sword at chest height in a broad sweep. Gennady ducked below the weapon and took the man's legs from beneath him with one arm. This allowed the sword's momentum to continue its upward swing, biting into the side of the head of another man trying to escape the wolf. As the routed ran, Gennady stopped for a moment, his pelt slick with mud and gore, and roared a triumphant celebration of the battle that echoed into the distance. The fighting had been brief, and now the murder and the butchering began. He pinned one unfortunate to the muddy floor. The squirming man now was crying out and begging. He'd heard many people's pleas in the past. He had never listened to their cries for mercy, so it was unlikely that they would be heard and responded to in this reversed situation. Gennady moved a foot to the man's left thigh and held him securely while he reached down to the lumbar region of the fallen one's back. He reached into the body of the man and let his fingers wrap around the lower spine. With inhuman force he tore the spine upwards along the vertex of the torso until it came free. It was a neat job, with the head remaining attached at the cervical terminus. He raised it above his own head as the blood ran down his arm, dripping from his elbow to the floor, and let out his roar of joy. Casting his momentary trophy at the nearest man, he continued with the killing, chasing down any of the band members he could catch to murder as they had murdered others. He left only one man to get home, one man that could share the story of this night, and one man who would warn his tribe not to move eastward into this area once more. That was Meeting Grandfather. If you'd like to support the show, there is a link that says support the show down in the description. Thank you for listening. Please share this with other people who might be interested in blood, snot and werewolves. Love you loads. Bye.